The dust didn't care who you were. It just blew across the empty land, whispering about old bones and older sorrows. Ida felt it on her cracked lips, in her dry throat. She was 26, but her soul felt 100 years old. For 3 days, she'd been walking away from a life that was never hers, away from a house where love was spelled with a closed fist. The night she ran, the moon was a sliver of bone in the sky. She'd slipped out while he was drunk, his snores rattling the thin walls. His mother's glare followed her even in the dark. Useless girl, the old woman always hissed. Maybe she was, but she was a free girl now. Her ribs still ached from his last goodbye. In her satchel, she carried three things: a Bible, a wool shawl, and a little leather book. Her whole life tucked into a bag. She collapsed under a cottonwood, the shade as thin as her hope. She was just about to close her eyes to give in to the quiet when she heard it. A shout. Not an animal. It was human, raw with pain. It came from the rocks up ahead. Then it just stopped. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden. Trouble had a way of finding her, and she was done with trouble. But the silence that followed the scream was worse than the scream itself. Something inside her, something that hadn't been beaten out of her yet, pushed her to her feet. Her legs shook, but she climbed. She reached the edge of a canyon, and the sun stabbed at her eyes. Down below, sprawled on the jagged stones, was a man. He looked like he'd been thrown from the sky and broken by the earth. His arm was twisted under him, his shirt dark with blood. He was Apache. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her gut. She'd heard the stories. Savages, raiders. But as she looked down at the man gasping on the rocks, she didn't see a monster from a story. She saw a man just as broken and alone as she was. She scrambled down the slope, loose gravel skittering under her boots. His eyes fluttered open as she knelt beside him. They were dark, clouded with pain. She braced herself for hate, for anger, but all she saw was a man too tired to fight anymore. "You'll die out here," she whispered, not even sure if he understood. He tried to speak, but a wet cough shook his body. "Don't," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Save your strength." She pulled his arm free. He grunted but didn't fight her. She tore a strip from her ruined skirt and pressed it to the wound on his shoulder. The blood was hot, sticky, but the pressure seemed to slow it down. She tied the makeshift bandage as tight as she could. The sun was sinking fast and the desert air was already turning cold. He wouldn't last the night. She gathered branches, struck her flint against steel until a spark caught, and coaxed a small flame to life. The firelight danced on the canyon walls. The man stirred. He muttered something in a language she didn't know. Then, his voice raspy, he forced out two words in English. "Why? Help?" Ida looked at the flames. She could have told him about her husband, about the cruelty, about being so tired of watching people suffer. But the words that came out were simpler. "Because you're alive." His eyes closed. She didn't know if he'd heard her. Night fell. Ida fed the fire, listening to the wind howl. She was a runaway wife, sitting in a canyon with a wounded Apache. The world was a strange and terrible place. In the flickering light, she saw the strength in his face, a dignity that even this much pain couldn't erase. Exhaustion finally pulled her down. She leaned against a rock, her hand near the fire, and drifted into a restless sleep. She woke with a start, the fire nearly dead. The cold was a physical thing, a weight on her chest. She pushed another branch into the embers and glanced at the man. His eyes were open. He was watching her. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind. Then his lips moved, forming a single word, rough but clear. "Coal." She blinked, confused. "Coal," he repeated with a slow, deliberate nod. A weary smile touched her lips. "Ida," she said, touching her own chest. His gaze held hers. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. Two broken people in the middle of nowhere, clinging to their own names. The morning came, pale and cold. Ida gave him water from her cup. He drank slowly, his hand trembling. His English was broken, like shattered rock. "You stay? Why?" She looked at him, at the raw pain in his eyes that had nothing to do with his wound. "Because I know what it's like to be left for dead." That was all she said. It was enough. Something in his eyes softened. The next 2 days were a blur of gathering wood, boiling water, and changing the bandage on his shoulder. He showed her which herbs to crush and press into the wound to keep the fever down. His hands were scarred, but his touch was surprisingly gentle when he guided her fingers. They didn't talk much. They just existed, two lonely flames under an empty sky. One night, she dared to ask, "Do you have a family?" He stared into the fire for a long time. She thought he wouldn't answer. Then his voice was flat. "Wife, gone." He touched his heart, then pointed to the sky. "Soldiers," he said. "Mistake." The words were like stones dropping into a deep, dark well. She didn't tell him about her own husband. Not the whole story. She just said, "I'm sorry." He nodded once, accepting her words like he accepted the coming of winter. Sorrow was just another season. On the third day, he tried to stand. He braced himself against the rock, his teeth clenched and nearly fell. "You shouldn't," she said, rushing to his side. He held up a hand. "Must walk or die." "Stubborn man." She slipped her shoulder under his arm and helped him climb out of the canyon. He was taller than she'd realized, his frame lean but powerful. By noon, they found a small clearing with a trickle of water. He sank to the ground, showing her how to steep pine needles in hot water. The tea was bitter, but it was warm. "Good," he grunted. It was the first time a man had said something kind to her in years. That night, the stars were sharp and cold. Cole sat across the fire, carefully mending the bandage. "Why you leave?" he asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. The old shame washed over her. "My husband," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was not kind." Cole's eyes narrowed, but he stayed silent. "His family, they never wanted me. Said I was poor stock." The words tumbled out, shaky and raw. He believed them. Her voice broke. She turned away, hiding her tears. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then Cole's voice, low and hard as granite. "Man who strikes woman is no man." Her breath hitched. No one had ever defended her before. Not once. She met his gaze across the flames. His eyes were hard, yes, but she saw something else in them. A fire that matched her own. A fire that refused to go out. The days got colder. They moved slow. Cole showing her how to read tracks in the snow, how to find dry wood. She absorbed every lesson, hungry for a knowledge that wasn't about pleasing a man or keeping a house. One afternoon, they stood on a ridge overlooking a vast, empty valley. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Home," he said. The word was heavy with loss. "Even after everything?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "Home is not land. Home is memory." He touched his chest. "Here." The words hit her harder than any fist ever had. She thought of the life she dreamed of, a life she never got. Maybe home wasn't a place you lived. Maybe it was a person you shared a fire with. That night, the wind was a knife. She shivered, pulling her thin shawl around her. Without a word, Cole shifted, lifting the edge of his blanket. An invitation. She hesitated for only a second before sliding closer, letting his warmth seep into her bones. They sat in silence. Two strangers huddled together against the dark. "Do you think hearts can ever heal?" she whispered. He looked down at her, his face hidden in shadow. "Scars are strong," he finally said. "Stronger than skin." She rested her head against his arm. She had plenty of scars. Maybe his were strong enough for both of them. It wasn't love. It wasn't anything she could name. It was just hope. And for now, hope was enough. But as she drifted off to sleep, her hand brushed against something hard tucked into his belt. It wasn't a knife. It felt like a piece of metal, cold and heavy. On one side, she could feel a raised symbol. It was a sheriff's badge, and it was tarnished with old dark blood. Ida's blood ran cold. A sheriff's badge? What was an Apache man doing with a lawman's badge, especially one stained with blood? Every story she'd ever been told screamed at her to run. This man wasn't just a victim. He was something else, something dangerous. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her heart hammering against her ribs. She lay there feigning sleep, listening to his steady breathing, and every breath sounded like a lie. The next morning, she couldn't look him in the eye. She was quiet, jumpy. He noticed. "You are afraid," he said. It wasn't a question. "Should I be?" She shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. He just watched her, his dark eyes unreadable. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain. That was somehow worse. They walked in silence, the unspoken question hanging between them like a shroud. Later that day, he was teaching her how to set a snare. His hands moved with a practiced efficiency that was almost hypnotic. She saw it then, a faint scar on the back of his hand, a brand. It was a simple shape, a cross inside a circle. She'd seen that mark before. It was the brand of the territorial prison, the mark they put on the worst criminals, murderers, thieves. Her breath hitched. The man she had saved, the man she had shared a fire with, the man whose warmth had kept her from freezing, was a convict, and he was carrying a dead sheriff's badge. Her mind raced. The soldiers, the mistake that killed his wife. Was that a lie? Did he kill that sheriff? Was that why he was wounded and alone in the wilderness? Was she traveling with a killer? The fear was so strong it tasted like metal in her mouth. She thought of her husband's fists, of the life she'd run from. Had she just traded one monster for another? That night she couldn't sleep. She clutched the small Bible in her satchel, its worn leather a poor comfort. The fire seemed to cast monstrous shadows on Cole's face. She had to know. "The badge," she whispered into the darkness. He didn't move, but she knew he was awake. "Where did you get it?" The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. She thought he wouldn't answer. Then his voice was low, devoid of emotion. "From the man who killed my wife." The words hit her like a physical blow. Not soldiers, a man, a sheriff. "He came to our land," Cole continued, his voice still flat, as if telling a story about someone else. "Said we were on his claim. My wife, she tried to reason with him. He was drunk, angry." He paused, and in the quiet, Ada could hear the tremor in his breath. He pushed her. She fell, hit her head on the stone hearth. He stared into the fire, but Ada knew he wasn't seeing the flames. He was seeing that moment over and over again. He laughed, said she was clumsy, then he rode away. "You went after him," she whispered, understanding dawning. "I found him in the canyon," Cole said. "We fought. He was fast, but I was faster." His hand unconsciously went to the wound on his shoulder. "He shot me before he died." So that's what happened. Not an accident, not a simple fall. It was justice, or revenge. The line was blurry out here in the dust and the rock. He had killed a man, a lawman. He was a fugitive, and by helping him, she was now an accomplice. Just when she thought things couldn't get any more complicated, they heard the sound of riders in the distance. Cole was on his feet in an instant, his body coiled like a snake ready to strike. "They come," he said, his voice a low growl. "Who?" she asked, her heart pounding. "His friends." From the ridge she saw them. 3 riders, moving with purpose. They weren't just wandering, they were hunting. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, they weren't just hunting for Cole. She'd seen the man in the lead before, the broad black hat, the cruel slope of his shoulders. It was one of her husband's men, Jedediah, a man who enjoyed his work far too much. But why would he be out here? Why would he be with lawmen looking for an Apache fugitive? It didn't make any sense. Unless they weren't looking for Cole at all. Unless they were looking for her. But that didn't make sense either. Her husband, Silas, would be angry she ran, but he wouldn't send men this far. He was too cheap, too lazy. Then she remembered the little leather book in her satchel, her journal, and she remembered the last thing she had tucked inside it before she fled. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't a prayer. It was a deed to a silver mine, signed over to her husband, a deed she knew for a fact he had stolen from a dead man. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. They weren't after her because she was a runaway wife. They were after her because she was a witness, and she was carrying the proof. The realization hit Ida like a ton of bricks. Silas didn't want his wife back. He wanted the deed. He wanted to silence the only person who knew he was a thief and a fraud. Jedediah wasn't here to bring her home. He was here to put her in the ground. And Cole was a complication they hadn't counted on. "We have to move," she said, her voice tight with a new kind of fear. This was bigger than a drunken husband. This was about greed, and men would kill for a lot less. Cole nodded, his eyes scanning the train. "They will track us." "How?" He pointed to the sky, where a hawk circled lazily. "They have a scout, one of ours, a man who sold his eyes." An Apache scout tracking an Apache fugitive. The irony was as bitter as the desert wind. They traveled fast, pushing deeper into the mountains. Cole moved with a silent grace, his injured shoulder seeming to barely slow him down. He was a ghost in the landscape, and she did her best to follow, her city-bred clumsiness a loud counterpoint to his silence. The pursuit was relentless. Twice they had to scramble for cover as the riders appeared on a nearby ridge, their silhouettes dark against the sky. They were being herded, pushed towards something. That night they made a cold camp, no fire. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on them. "He's good," Cole said, breaking the silence. His voice was grim. "The scout. His name is Kyle. We were boys together." The betrayal in his tone was a fresh wound. "Why would he help them?" Ada whispered. "Gold," Cole said. The word a curse. "They promise him gold." Ada clutched her satchel. The deed inside felt heavy, dangerous. She had grabbed it on impulse, a small act of defiance against the man who had taken everything from her. She never imagined it would be her death warrant. "This is my fault," she said, the guilt a heavy stone in her stomach. "They're after me." Cole turned to her, his face a pale oval in the faint starlight. "They are after the paper. You are just in the way." His bluntness should have hurt, but it didn't. It was the truth. "What did your husband do?" he asked. So she told him. She told him about Silas's late-night card games, about the prospector who had stumbled into town with a map and a claim, about how the man had turned up dead in an alley a week later, his pockets empty, the sheriff ruling it a drunken brawl, and about how, a few days after that, Silas had come home with the deed laughing. Cole listened, his silence a heavy blanket. "This man," he said when she finished, "the one who died. What was his name?" "Amos. Amos Kane." Cole went still, so still he seemed to stop breathing. "Amos Kane," he repeated, the name a strange and terrible sound in the dark. "You knew him?" she asked. "He was my friend," Cole said, his voice thick with a sorrow that felt ancient. "He was married to my wife's sister. He was prospecting to earn money to bring her here." The world tilted on its axis. The dead prospector, Cole's family, her husband, the murderer. The threads were all connected, a tangled, bloody knot. This wasn't a coincidence. This was fate, cruel and inescapable. The men hunting them weren't just chasing a runaway wife and an Apache killer. They were chasing the last two people who could link Silas and Jedediah to the murder of Amos Kane. And then, as if the night couldn't get any darker, they heard a sound. It wasn't the riders. It was the cry of a child. Faint, terrified, and very, very close. The cry cut through the cold night air, sharp and desperate. Cole tensed, his hand immediately going to the knife at his belt. Ada's heart leaped into her throat. A child? "Out here?" "Stay," Cole ordered in a low whisper, and then he was gone, melting into the shadows like he was born from them. Ada waited, every nerve screaming. The crying had stopped, replaced by a silence that was even more terrifying. What if it was a trap? What if Jedediah and his men were using a child as bait? Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally he returned. In his arms he carried a small girl, no more than 7 or 8. She was thin, her dress was torn, and her dark eyes were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have stolen her voice. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just shivering, a silent, trembling bundle in Cole's arms. Like Cole, she was Apache. He gently set her down by Ida. The girl flinched, scrambling back until she hit the cold rock wall of their hiding place. "Where did you find her?" Ida whispered. "Her village was attacked," Cole said, his voice tight with fury. "By them." He didn't need to say who. Jedediah. The men hunting them. They weren't just killers and thieves. They were monsters. "They were looking for something," Cole continued. "Searching the lodges. They took the men. The women, they... He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The little girl just stared, her eyes hollow. Ida's heart broke. She slowly reached out a hand, not touching, just offering. "It's all right," she murmured. "You're safe now." The girl didn't respond. She just watched Cole, a strange look in her eyes. It wasn't just fear. It was, recognition. Cole crouched down, speaking to her softly in their shared tongue. The words were gentle, a stark contrast to the violence in his eyes. The girl finally answered, her voice a tiny, cracked whisper. Cole's face hardened. He looked at Ida, and his expression was grim. "Her name is Lena," he said. "They killed her parents. They were looking for a map. Her father was the cartographer for our tribe. A map. Amos Kane had a map. Now these men were tearing apart villages looking for another one." "What's on this map?" Ida asked. "The silver," Cole said. "The claim your husband stole was just one strike. The map shows the whole motherlode. A river of silver running through these mountains." This was what it was all about. A fortune big enough to build a kingdom on. Big enough to kill for. Lena, the little girl who had seen her world burn, was now another loose end. Another witness. Just like them. "We have to take her with us," Ida said, her voice firm. Cole hesitated. A child would slow them down. She was a liability. But then he looked at Lena, at her small, trembling form, and he saw his own loss reflected in her empty eyes. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. They had a new responsibility. A small, silent shadow who clung to Ida's skirt and watched Cole with an unnerving intensity. The next day, as they were moving through a dense patch of forest, Lena tugged on Ida's sleeve. She pointed a small, dirt-stained finger at Cole's back. She whispered a single word in her own language. Ida didn't understand it, but the tone was clear. It was a question. Ida looked at Cole for a translation. He had stopped, his back still to him. He seemed frozen. "What did she say?" Ida asked. Cole turned around slowly. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were churning with a storm of emotions she couldn't read. He looked at the little girl. "She wants to know," he said, his voice flat and heavy, "why I am wearing her father's knife." The accusation hung in the air, sharper than the cold. Ida stared at the knife on Cole's belt. The handle was carved bone, inlaid with a small turquoise stone. It was beautiful, unique, the kind of thing a man would be known for. Lena wasn't mistaken. Ida's mind reeled. The raid on the village. Cole showing up just after, with the dead mapmaker's knife. No, it couldn't be. But the doubt was a poison, seeping into her thoughts. What did she really know about this man? He was a convict, a killer. He'd admitted to killing the sheriff. Who was to say he hadn't been part of the raid? Maybe he'd betrayed his own people for a share of the silver. The scout, Kyle, had been his childhood friend. Maybe they were working together. Cole's face was unreadable. He looked from Lena's terrified face to Ida's shocked one. He slowly drew the knife from its sheath. He didn't hold it like a weapon. He held it like a burden. He knelt in front of Lena, speaking in the Apache tongue. His voice was low, urgent, filled with a pain that felt real. Ida couldn't understand the words, but she watched the little girl's face. The terror slowly faded, replaced by confusion, and then by a wave of grief so profound it made her own sorrows feel small. Lena let out a choked sob and threw her arms around Cole's neck, weeping into his shoulder. He held her, his eyes closed, his face a mask of agony. After a long moment, he looked up at Ida. "Her father was my brother," he said, his voice raw. The pieces slammed together in Ida's mind. The reason he was so driven, so full of rage. The reason he'd taken the sheriff's badge. It wasn't just about his wife. It was about his whole family, torn apart by the same greedy men. "I found him after the raid," Cole explained, his voice rough. "Kyle and the others were gone. He was dying. He gave me the knife. He told me to protect Lena, and he told me where he hid the map. So he had it. The key to everything. The thing Jedediah and his men were willing to kill for." "Where is it?" Ada breathed. Cole didn't answer. He just looked at Lena, now asleep in his arms, her small face tear-stained and peaceful for the first time. The weight of the world was on his shoulders. He was protecting the last of his family in a secret that could get them all killed. That night, the dynamic shifted. There was no more suspicion between them. There was only a shared purpose, a grim understanding of the stakes. They were no longer just two runaways. They were the guardians of an orphan in a treasure map. They were a family forged in blood and fire, but their enemies were closing in. The next day, they found the tracks. Not horses this time. A single man on foot. "Kyle," Cole said, his voice a low growl. The scout had abandoned the riders. He was hunting them on his own terms now, in his own element. He would be faster, quieter, more deadly. They were no longer the hunted. They were the prey. They climbed higher, into the treacherous, snow-dusted peaks. The air grew thin and cold. Lena shivered in Ida's arms, her breathing shallow. They found a shallow cave, barely a cleft in the rock, to shelter from the wind. It was there that Cole finally revealed the secret. He unwrapped the bandage on his shoulder. Underneath the fresh dressing of herbs, the wound was healing cleanly. But around it, tattooed into his skin in faint, faded ink, were lines and symbols. It wasn't a tattoo. It was the map. It had been on him the entire time, hidden in plain sight. "My brother was clever," Cole said. "He knew they would search his lodge, search his body. He put the map where they would never think to look. On me." But Ida saw something else. She saw a brand near the edge of the tattoo. The prison brand. A cross inside a circle. It was placed deliberately, right over a key landmark on the map. "The prison brand," she whispered. "It's part of the map, isn't it?" Cole nodded grimly. "The entrance to the main vein is not in the mountains. It's underneath the old territorial prison. Right under their feet." The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. To hide a treasure not in the wilderness, but in the heart of his enemy's power. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the mouth of the cave. A man stood there, silhouetted against the gray sky. He was Apache, his face lean and hard, his eyes as cold as the wind. "Brother," Kyle said to Cole, his voice soft and full of menace, "I have been looking for you." Kyle stepped into the cave, his movements fluid and dangerous. He wasn't looking at Ida or Lena. His eyes were locked on Cole, a mixture of pity and contempt in his gaze. "You should not have run, Cole," he said in perfect English. "Jedediah is not a patient man." "You call that dog by his name?" Cole snarled, rising to his feet. He placed himself between Kyle and the two females, his body a shield. "He pays well," Kyle said with a shrug. "Better than chasing rabbits for the elders." He glanced at the map on Cole's skin. "My share of that will set me up for life. A ranch, cattle, a white woman to warm my bed." The words were meant to provoke, and they did. Cole lunged, not with the knife, but with his bare hands. The two men crashed against the cave wall, a whirlwind of desperate, brutal motion. They were a mirror image of each other. Two men from the same tribe, the same blood, now on opposite sides of a bloody line drawn by greed. Kyle was younger, faster, but Cole fought with the fury of a man with nothing left to lose. Ada huddled in the back of the cave, shielding Lena with her body. The little girl was whimpering, her face buried in Ida's skirt. The fight was short and ugly. Cale got the upper hand, his knife flashing. He slashed Cole across the ribs, a shallow but painful cut. Cole grunted, stumbling back. Kyle grinned, his teeth white in the dim light. "It is over, brother. Give me the girl. Jedediah wants to ask her some questions. Then you and I will go see the warden about getting that map off your skin." He took a step forward, and Ida moved. She didn't think. She just acted. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from their meager supplies and swung it with all the force of her fear and rage. It connected with the side of Cale's head with a sickening crack. His eyes went wide with surprise, and then he crumpled to the floor of the cave, unconscious. Silence. Ida stood over him, the skillet still in her hand, her arm trembling. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She had never struck anyone in her life, not even her husband. Cole stared at her, a new respect dawning in his eyes. He clutched his side, blood seeping between his fingers. "You are strong," he breathed. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm just done being afraid." They tied Kale up with strips of rawhide. He was a problem, but he was also an opportunity. "He can lead us to them," Cole said, his mind already working. "We will set a trap." It was a desperate plan, a wild gamble, but it was better than running. They left the cave at dusk, taking Kale with them. He was awake now, sullen and silent. Cole, using Kale's knowledge of Jedediah's movements, led them to a narrow pass, the only way down from the high peaks. It was called Devil's Jaw, a treacherous bottleneck of rock and shadow. "They will come through here at dawn," Cole said. "They will be expecting Kale to lead them to us." The trap was simple, brutal, and relied on the element of surprise. Ida's role was crucial. She wasn't a fighter, but she had something more valuable: the deed. As the first pale light of dawn touched the sky, they heard the horses. Jedediah and his two remaining men rode into the pass, confident, arrogant. "Kyle!" Jedediah shouted. "You find them!" From a ledge above, Cole pushed Kyle out into the open, his hands still bound. Jedediah's face twisted in a snarl. "You worthless snake!" He raised his rifle. "Wait!" Ida's voice echoed in the canyon. She stepped out from behind a rock, holding up the deed. "This is what you want, isn't it, Jedediah?" she called out. "Silas sent you for this." Jedediah hesitated, his eyes fixed on the paper. Greed warred with caution. "Throw it down, girl," he growled. "Come and get it," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Unless you want me to burn it, then all this killing will have been for nothing." It was a bluff, but a good one. Jedediah cursed and dismounted, telling his men to cover him. He started climbing the rocky slope towards her. That was the signal. From his hiding place, Cole used the last of his strength to shove a massive, precariously balanced boulder. It teetered for a moment and then fell, triggering a rock slide. It wasn't a huge one, but it was enough. Rocks and scree poured down into the narrow pass, blocking the exit. Jedediah's men were trapped, their horses panicking. Jedediah was halfway up the slope. He turned, his face a mask of rage, and fired his pistol at Ida. She cried out and fell back, but the bullet only grazed her arm. Cole was on him in a second. They tumbled down the slope, a desperate tangle of limbs. Jedediah was bigger, stronger, but Cole was fighting for his family, for his home. They landed at the bottom of the pass. Jedediah scrambled for his gun, but someone else got there first. Kyle, who had managed to cut his bonds on a sharp rock during the chaos, picked up the pistol. Jedediah looked at him, a bloody grin spreading across his face. "Good man, Kyle. Kill the convict. The silver is ours." Kale looked at Jedediah. He looked at Cole, struggling to rise. He looked up the slope at Ada, who was clutching Lena, protecting her. He saw the greed in the white man's eyes. He saw the honor in Cole's, and he made a choice. He turned the gun on Jedediah. "For my people," he said, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon, a final, definitive crack. Jedediah fell, his surprised expression frozen on his face. His two men, trapped by the rock slide and seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons in surrender. It was over. Cale dropped the gun, his face etched with a complex mix of shame and relief. He looked at Cole. "I chose wrong, brother," he said softly. Cole nodded, clutching his bleeding side. There would be time for forgiveness later. For now, there was only survival. They left Jedediah and his men tied up for the authorities who would inevitably come looking for them. They had the deed, and they had Jedediah's confession, which Ada had forced him to scribble on the back of the paper at gunpoint before the final confrontation. The story of Silas and the murder of Amos Kane was now on paper. Cale, his debt repaid in blood, chose to walk his own path, disappearing back into the mountains to find what was left of their people. As the sun rose higher, painting the peaks in gold, Ida, Cole, and Lena stood on the ridge, looking down at the valley below. They were battered, wounded, but they were alive, and they were free. Ida tended to Cole's wounds, her touch gentle. The anger and fear that had driven her for so long had been replaced by a quiet strength she never knew she possessed. Cole watched her, his gaze soft. You saved us, he said. We saved each other, she replied. They made their way down to the nearest town, not as fugitives, but as witnesses. Ada presented the deed and the confession to the territorial marshal. The story was wild, but the evidence was undeniable. Word came weeks later. Silas, her husband, had been arrested for murder and fraud. His family's name was ruined. Justice, it turned out, could find you even in the darkest corners of the world. The deed to the silver mine, legally stolen from Amos Kane, was now ownerless. As Kane's next of kin through his wife's sister, the claim passed to Cole, and through him, to Lena. They had a future. They didn't go back to the mountains. They bought a small parcel of land in a quiet valley, far from the greed and ghosts of their past. They built a small house with their own hands. Cole with his strength and knowledge of the land. Ida with her fierce determination. Lena with her bright, returning laughter. One evening as the sun set, they sat on the porch of their new home. Lena was chasing fireflies in the yard. Ida was reading from her little leather book, teaching Cole his letters. His large scarred hand rested over hers. It wasn't a perfect life. The scars were still there, on their skin and on their souls. But they were stronger than skin. They were a family, not by blood, but by choice. Forged in the wilderness, bound by a shared fire. And in the quiet of the evening, surrounded by the home they had built, they were finally at peace. They had found their way through the darkness and had come out the other side, not broken but remade, stronger, together. If you were moved by Ida and Cole's journey to find justice and a place to call home, please hit that like button. And for more stories about the unexpected places we find strength and family, don't forget to subscribe.